I still vividly remember Karen's face when she received the court order, eyes bulging like she'd just swallowed a whole lemon, peel and all. The HOA president had been so confident when changing the lock on my ranch gate, thinking their regulations were untouchable, but they didn't know that very action had inadvertently stepped right into the legal trap I'd been setting for months. I didn't just get my ranch back. I forced the entire HOA board to resign and pay $250,000 in damages. Hey, where are you watching from? Comment ranch if you've ever had to deal with an HOA like this. Let me tell you how I turned my HOA nightmare into the sweetest victory of my life. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Official HOA letterhead with that pretentious embossed logo they'd adopted last year. I remember standing at the end of my driveway, 20 acres of Texas pasture land stretching behind me, thinking this couldn't possibly apply to my property. The Reynolds family ranch had stood here long before the surrounding developments had sprung up, before the fancy neighborhoods with their matching mailboxes had encroached on what used to be open country. My father had purchased this land back in the 1970s, and I'd moved back after 15 years as a corporate attorney in Houston to honor his legacy after he passed. The letter claimed my fence height and gate style violated new regulations and demanded compliance within 30 days, or I'd face daily fines. I walked back to the house, boots kicking up dust along the path my father had worn over decades of dedicated work on this land. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pasture where a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully, unaware of the bureaucratic nonsense threatening our quiet existence. Inside, I tossed the letter onto the kitchen table, solid oak that Dad had built by hand the year I was born, and poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon. The amber liquid caught the sunlight streaming through windows that faced west, deliberately positioned to catch those famous Texas sunsets my father had loved so much. I dealt with enough legal nonsense in my career to know when someone was overstepping their boundaries. My property was specifically excluded from HOA jurisdiction through a grandfather clause in the original deed, something I'd made certain of before leaving my law career behind. The 20-acre ranch was my sanctuary, my escape from the corporate rat race that had nearly burned me out completely by age 38. I wasn't about to let some power-hungry neighborhood association start dictating what I could and couldn't do with my family's land. The next day, I drove to the community center where one Deborah Wilson held court as the self-appointed neighborhood savior. The modern building stood in stark contrast to the older structures in town, its sleek lines and manicured landscaping a physical manifestation of the HOA's vision for the area. As I walked through the automatic glass doors, the blast of air conditioning hit me like a cold rebuke, erasing all traces of the authentic Texas heat. Deborah was pushing 60, perfectly coiffed blonde hair that hadn't moved since the Bush administration, and the perpetual expression of someone who'd just caught a whiff of something unpleasant. Her husband Richard stood behind her, tall and gray-hailed, with the practiced smile of a politician or car salesman, neither profession inspiring much trust. The community center office had that sterile feel of places where petty power is exercised with great ceremony. Mr. Reynolds, Deborah's voice had that patronizing tone reserved for children and people she considered beneath her station. I understand you're upset, but these regulations were passed for everyone's benefit. Property values are our primary concern. She slid a pamphlet across the desk like she was bestowing a great gift. Here's our complete set of guidelines. You'll need to lower your fence to 4 feet and replace that rustic wooden gate with an approved model. We have 3 styles to choose from. Her smile never reached her eyes. We're simply ensuring neighborhood aesthetic cohesion. I noticed a wall behind her desk, covered with before and after photos of properties that had been improved under her leadership. Under her leadership, charming, diverse homes transformed into cookie-cutter versions of suburban conformity. Each photo was accompanied by property value increases, displayed with the reverence other offices might reserve for employee achievement awards. I placed my own folder on the desk and removed several documents. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Wilson, but as these papers clearly show, my property is exempt from HOA jurisdiction. This grandfather clause was established when the developments around my ranch were first approved. My land was here decades before your association existed. I tapped the relevant paragraph, highlighted in yellow. My father ensured this protection when he allowed the county to run an access road along the western edge of our property. Deborah barely glanced at the documents. That might have been the case originally, but our new bylaws supersede any previous arrangements. The committee voted unanimously. She looked smug, as though that settled everything. We've been working very hard to clean up certain rustic elements that are dragging down property values. 30 days, Mr. Reynolds. Then the fines begin at $100 per day. The only sympathetic face in the room belonged to Tom Miller, a 40-something former public works employee who served on the board. While Deborah was speaking, he frowned slightly and shook his head, the tiniest gesture of disagreement. As I gathered my documents, he approached me in the parking lot. Jake, just wanted you to know not everyone's on board with Deborah's methods. He glanced back toward the building. She's been targeting properties she considers undesirable since taking over as president last year. Between us, she may have pushed through some of these new regulations without proper authority. Tom shifted nervously, eyes constantly scanning the parking lot as though worried about being seen talking to me. Listen, there's been talk at recent closed meetings, stuff that doesn't make it into the official minutes. Deborah has some kind of master plan for this area, and your ranch seems to be a particular focus. A car door slammed nearby, making him jump. I should go. Just be careful. The Wilsons play hardball, and they've pushed out other homeowners who didn't fall in line. That conversation with Tom was the first hint that I might want to play the long game here. Something about Deborah's crusade against my property didn't add up. Instead of charging ahead with a direct legal confrontation, I decided to dig deeper. That evening, I spread my father's old property documents across the kitchen table and began researching Texas property laws and HOA limitations. Working late into the night, I discovered numerous cases where overzealous HOAs had been successfully challenged when they exceeded their authority. I sensed there was something more to Deborah's sudden interest in my non-compliant gate and fence than mere aesthetics. What I didn't realize was that Deborah was already watching my every move, and she wouldn't wait the full 30 days before making her next move. The county records office was housed in a 1970s brick building that smelled perpetually of old paper and industrial cleaner. I'd spent the morning poring over property maps and title histories, trying to build a clearer picture of my legal standing. That's where I met Sarah Thompson, a 35-year-old records clerk whose efficiency and knowledge of local property history proved invaluable. At first, she was just helpful, pulling the right files, pointing me toward useful resources, but over lunch at the diner across the street, her real motivations emerged. The diner was a classic small-town establishment. Red vinyl booths worn smooth from decades of use, the air thick with the scent of coffee and homemade pie. A signed portrait of George Strait hung near the register, slightly faded but treated with the reverence usually reserved for religious icons in this part of Texas. We sat by the window, watching county employees and locals pass by on the sun-drenched sidewalk outside. The Wilsons had been trying to influence county decisions for years, Sarah confided, stirring her iced tea. The ice clinked against the glass as a ceiling fan lazily pushed the cool air around us. Richard sits on the zoning board and has mysterious connections with several development companies. My father worked in the building inspector's office until Richard orchestrated his dismissal after Dad refused to fast-track approvals for one of his projects. Her eyes hardened at the memory. When I saw you researching your property in relation to their HOA, I figured you'd want to know what you're really up against. Derek pushed her plate aside and leaned forward, lowering her voice, though the nearest diners were several booths away. They're not just control freaks, they're methodical. They identify properties they want, find or invent violations, then apply pressure until owners give up and sell, usually below market value, to shell companies that somehow always trace back to Richard's investment group. She pulled a small notebook from her purse, flipping through pages of handwritten notes. I've been tracking their patterns for 2 years, ever since my father. Sarah directed me toward records I might have missed. Specifically, documents related to Summit Resorts, a luxury development company that had recently purchased 3 large parcels surrounding my property. They've been buying up everything in that area, she explained. And guess who owns a significant stake in Summit? Richard Wilson. He's been quietly investing in their projects for years. Back at her small desk, tucked between towering filing cabinets, Sarah pulled up digital scans of property purchases surrounding my ranch. A pattern emerged. Over the past 18 months, 9 properties adjacent to or near mine had changed hands, all purchased by different LLCs that shared the same registration address in Delaware. Classic shell company structure, she explained, pointing to the repeating address. They work hard to hide the connections, but if you know where to look, the pattern is clear. The picture was becoming clearer. My ranch wasn't just an aesthetic issue for the HOA. It was the last obstacle in what appeared to be a major development plan. I dug deeper and discovered something my father had never mentioned, a special agreement with the local government that granted perpetual right-of-ways access through our property to a public water reservoir. This easement made my land not just privately owned property, but part of what Texas law defined as an agricultural heritage easement, with special protections against development or interference. The afternoon sun slanted through dusty windows as Sarah and I pieced together the story. The Wilsons' connections ran deeper than I'd imagined. Planning Commission, Water Authority, even the county judge's campaign had received substantial donations from Richard or his associated businesses. They've built themselves a little empire of influence, Sarah observed as we reviewed campaign finance documents. Half the county officials owe them favors. That's why they've gotten away with so much for so long. Back at the ranch, I began documenting everything. I installed security cameras at my gate and property boundaries and started recording every interaction with HOA members. I also began researching the backgrounds of everyone on the HOA board, looking for potential allies or weak links in Deborah's armor. A week later, I received notice of an emergency amendment to HOA regulations regarding access rights to properties, clearly aimed at my situation. The certified letter arrived with a formal tone that barely concealed its threatening intent. The new amendment granted the HOA emergency access authority to any property deemed potentially hazardous to community standards. Vague language designed to create a back door to properties like mine. The emergency designation conveniently bypassed normal voting procedures and notice requirements. It was a power grab disguised as community protection. Tom Miller called me that evening, speaking in hushed tones. The connection crackled as though he were calling from somewhere with poor reception, deliberately making the call away from his home. They're moving faster than usual on this, Jake. Richard brought in their attorney to find ways to force compliance or make you sell. Deborah's telling everyone your property decreases neighborhood values by 15%, though she has no actual appraisals to back that up. They're applying financial and legal pressure until you give in. I've seen them do it before. He paused. I can't be seen openly opposing them, but I'll help however I can. Just be careful, they play dirty. Outside my window, a pickup truck I didn't recognize drove slowly past my property for the third time that evening. The driver appeared to be photographing my gate and fencing. The Wilsons were clearly documenting what they considered violations, building their case against me. Two could play at that game. I decided to set my first trap. I sent a formal letter of objection to the HOA, intentionally including a small loophole in my legal argument. It was subtle, just enough bait to see how Deborah would respond. I cited an outdated Texas property statute that had been amended 5 years earlier, a minor mistake any non-lawyer might make, but one that would give Deborah a sense of advantage. She took it beautifully, sending an internal email discussing my objection with the board, which Tom forwarded to me, where she admitted the true purpose. Reynolds' property is the final piece needed for the Summit project. Once we force him out, Richard's investment pays off and our properties all increase in value. Use whatever means necessary. The email contained more than just their intentions. It outlined a 6-month strategy for forcing me out, including escalating fines, potential water access disputes, and even suggestions to encourage neighbors to file noise complaints about non-existent livestock disturbances. They had planned every step of their harassment campaign, all documented in black and white. I had proof of their true motives, but I needed more. I needed them to commit a clear, illegal act that would trigger the protections my land enjoyed. And on a rainy Monday morning, Deborah handed me exactly what I needed when I returned from a weekend fishing trip to find a new padlock on my ranch gate and an official-looking notice declaring my property non-compliant with county safety standards. I stood in the rain, staring at the unfamiliar padlock securing my gate, feeling a mixture of rage and, strangely, satisfaction. The laminated notice zip-tied to the fence claimed my property had been declared unsafe, and access was restricted pending compliance with county health and safety codes. The HOA logo was prominently displayed at the bottom, with Deborah's flowing signature. My security cameras had captured the whole scene. Deborah, Richard, and Doug Peterson, the 62-year-old HOA treasurer, arriving at 7:30 that morning, removing my lock, installing theirs, and posting the notice. They'd even staged a little ceremony of it, Deborah taking photos of the men securing the property, as though they were performing some public service. I called the county offices immediately and spoke with Frank Martinez, the building inspector who supposedly had authorized this action. I never signed off on anything like that, Frank said, his voice tinged with alarm. That notice is a complete fabrication. They're using a template that looks like our official documents, but this wasn't issued by my department or anyone in the county. He paused. This isn't the first time the Wilsons have tried to leverage county authority they don't have. I can come out this afternoon to document this if you need me to. My next call was to the local sheriff's office, but as I suspected, they classified it as a civil dispute between me and the HOA. You'll need to take it up with them directly or pursue it through the courts, the deputy advised. We can't intervene in what appears to be a neighborhood association matter. This was frustrating, but expected, and part of the reason HOAs often act with such impunity. They exist in a gray area where law enforcement is reluctant to tread. I reached out to my old colleague Michael Blackwell, now a successful real estate attorney in Houston. Michael and I had worked together for years before I left the firm, and he specialized in property disputes. Jesus, Jake, he said after I explained the situation, they've handed you a lawsuit on a silver platter. This is textbook criminal trespass, interference with property rights, and given that easement you mentioned, possibly obstruction of a public access way, not to mention falsifying county documents. I could hear him shuffling papers. I'll draft an emergency injunction right away. Document everything, and don't do anything they could use against you. I'll drive up tomorrow morning. I wasn't willing to wait until tomorrow to access my own property. I called a locksmith who arrived an hour later, looking uncomfortable about the whole situation. Look, man, I don't want to get involved in any dispute, he said, eyeing the HOA notice. I just need to see proof this is your property. I showed him my deed and ID, and he reluctantly cut through the padlock, replacing it with a new one, for which I had the only key. I made sure my security cameras captured the entire process. That evening, Deborah Wilson appeared at my front door, flanked by Richard and Doug Peterson. I greeted them with my phone, recording video in plain sight. You had no right to remove our lock, Deborah snapped, her face flushed with anger. Your property has been deemed non-compliant, and the HOA has authority to restrict access until violations are addressed. I spoke with Frank Martinez at the county today, I replied calmly. He confirmed your notice is fraudulent. You falsified county documents, trespassed on my property, and illegally restricted my access. I'm filing for an emergency injunction tomorrow, and I've documented everything, including your little lock-changing ceremony this morning. I gestured toward my security cameras. Would you like to explain why you're targeting my property specifically? Richard stepped forward, his politician's demeanor slipping. The HOA has every right to protect neighborhood standards and property values. Your ranch, he practically spat the word, is an eyesore that's preventing essential community improvements. We've tried to be reasonable. You mean you've tried to force me out so Summit Resorts can buy my land for your development deal? I replied. Doug Peterson flinched visibly at these words. Yes, I know all about your investment in Summit and their plans for this area. You might want to consult a lawyer about conflict of interest laws, Richard. Deborah recovered quickly. This discussion is over. The HOA has voted to impose a $500 daily fine for your continued noncompliance and destruction of HOA property, the lock you removed. You'll be receiving official notice tomorrow. They turned to leave, but Deborah paused to deliver a final threat. This won't end well for you, Reynolds. The HOA always wins these disputes. I couldn't help but smile as they walked away. We'll see about that, I murmured, stopping the recording. They had just committed multiple violations of property law, all captured on video and admitted to imposing arbitrary fines without proper authority. Each action they took was another nail in their legal coffin. What I needed now was one more piece to complete my case, and the call I received the following day delivered exactly that. Mr. Reynolds, this is Frank Martinez from County Building Inspection. His voice sounded strained, uncomfortable. I'm calling because I received a formal complaint about your property this morning from Deborah Wilson. She's demanding I inspect your ranch for various code violations. He paused. Look, I don't normally do this, but I wanted to give you a heads up before I'm forced to come out there officially. The Wilsons have been putting pressure on various county departments for years, and I'm getting tired of being used as their personal enforcement tool. Frank agreed to meet me for coffee at a diner outside his jurisdiction where we wouldn't likely be seen together. In person, he looked like a man carrying too many burdens, mid-50s with deep creases around his eyes and the perpetual weariness of someone navigating political minefields while trying to do an honest job. The Wilsons have influenced half the appointments in this county, he explained, keeping his voice low despite the nearly empty restaurant. Richard has friends on the county commission, the planning board, even the water authority. They've been building this network for years. Frank slid a folder across the table. This is a copy of the original easement agreement your father signed with the county. It's more significant than you might realize. I opened it to find a detailed legal document from 1978, outlining the terms under which my father had granted access through our property. This isn't just any right-of-ways, Frank explained. It's classified as a critical infrastructure access point because it leads to the county reservoir. That puts it under special protections. No private entity, including an HOA, can legally restrict access to that road or the gate that leads to it. This was the missing piece I needed. The HOA hadn't just trespassed on private property, they'd interfered with county infrastructure access, a much more serious offense. Frank promised to include this information in his official report and to resist any pressure from the Wilsons to fabricate violations on my property. Just be prepared, he warned as we parted. They won't back down easily, not with what they have invested in this. Sarah from the county records office continued providing valuable information, uncovering documents that confirmed my ranch fell under the Agricultural Heritage Easement designation, a special Texas provision designed to protect historic agricultural lands from development pressure and overregulation. Sarah and I spent hours poring over these documents, building an ironclad case against HOA jurisdiction. My father would be proud, I told her as we organized the evidence. He always said knowledge was the best defense against bullies. Meanwhile, Deborah escalated her campaign against me, sending letters to all my neighbors, claiming my property was decreasing their home values and encouraging them to apply community pressure to force compliance. Several neighbors I'd barely spoken to suddenly became cold and distant at the local grocery store or gas station. Others reached out privately to express support, but were afraid to challenge the HOA openly. Deborah keeps files on everyone who opposes her, one neighbor confided. She finds some violation to target them with. Nobody wants to be next on her list. Michael Blackwell arrived from Houston and helped me prepare a comprehensive lawsuit against the HOA, Deborah and Richard personally, and a motion for emergency injunctive relief. But before filing, we decided on one final strategic move: to bait the HOA into committing one more clearly illegal act that would remove any doubt about their intentions and methods. I installed a large sign at my gate reading, "Property protected by heritage, easement, not subject to OA jurisdiction," with citations of the relevant Texas property statutes. It was perfectly legal, but precisely the kind of challenge Deborah couldn't ignore. Next to it, I placed a weatherproof box containing information sheets about property rights and HOA limitations that anyone could take, educational material for my neighbors who might be experiencing similar overreach. Tom Miller called that night, speaking quickly and quietly. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight. They're voting on a resolution to seize your property for non-payment of accumulated fines. Deborah claims you owe over $7,000 now. They're planning to come to your property tomorrow morning with a locksmith and formal notice of seizure." He seemed genuinely concerned. This goes beyond anything they've done before. I tried to argue it was illegal, but Richard shut me down. Just be prepared. I thanked Tom for the warning, then called Michael and Frank. Everything was falling into place. The HOA was about to walk into my final trap, and I would be ready when they arrived. What I didn't expect was that they would bring the entire HOA board to my gate at 7 a.m. the next morning, creating the perfect stage for the confrontation that would ultimately lead to their downfall. 7 a.m. sharp, headlights illuminated my driveway as a procession of 3 luxury SUVs rolled up to my gate. I was waiting, Michael Blackwell beside me, Frank Martinez parked discreetly down the road, and my security cameras rolling with a live backup to cloud storage. I'd set up a small table with coffee and legal documents, the perfect picture of calm preparation. I wanted them to see they weren't dealing with some pushover rancher, but someone who had anticipated their every move. The entire HOA board emerged from their vehicles: Deborah and Richard Wilson, Doug Peterson, Tom Miller, and Betty Sanderson, a retired school principal who handled community relations. Behind them, a nervous-looking young man clutched a locksmith's toolkit. Deborah carried a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be official documents. Her face set in that particular expression of grim satisfaction I'd come to recognize when she thought she was about to win. Mr. Reynolds, she announced loudly, as though addressing a public gathering rather than a private confrontation. As president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, I'm here to inform you that your property is being seized for non-payment of HOA fines totaling $7,300. She thrust a document toward me. You have violated 12 separate HOA regulations and ignored multiple notices. You now have two options. Pay the full amount immediately or vacate the premises while the association assumes control pending auction to recover costs. Michael stepped forward, introducing himself as my legal counsel. Before we proceed, I'd like to clarify that I'm recording this entire interaction as evidence for our pending legal case against the HOA and board members personally. He gestured toward the cameras. I should also inform you that you're currently trespassing on private property, not under HOA jurisdiction, and attempting to execute a property seizure with no legal authority to do so. Richard Wilson scoffed. We have every authority. The HOA bylaws clearly state. The bylaws have no bearing on this property, I interrupted, removing several documents from my folder. As you've been informed multiple times, this ranch is exempt from HOA jurisdiction through both the original grandfather clause and its designation as an agricultural heritage easement under Texas Property Code Section 423. I held up the county easement agreement. Furthermore, by attempting to restrict access to this gate, you're interfering with a county-designated critical infrastructure access point, which is a criminal offense under state law. Deborah's expression didn't change, but Doug Peterson began shifting uncomfortably. This is just a delay tactic, Deborah insisted. We've consulted our attorneys, and they've confirmed our right to enforce compliance. She nodded to the locksmith. Proceed with changing the locks. The young man took one step forward before Frank Martinez emerged from his vehicle, county inspector badge visible on his jacket. I wouldn't do that if I were you, son, he called out. Ms. Wilson, I'm here officially to confirm that this property does indeed fall under heritage easement protection and contains a county-designated essential access route. Any attempt to restrict access is interfering with county infrastructure, which I'd be obligated to report to the sheriff immediately. Tom Miller, who had remained silent until now, stepped away from the HOA group. I've been saying this has gone too far, he turned to face his colleagues. I've reviewed the documents myself. Reynolds' property is exempt, and we have no authority here. This seizure is illegal, and I won't be part of it. He moved to stand beside me, a clear declaration of where he stood. This public defection visibly rattled Deborah, her carefully maintained facade cracking slightly. Betty Sanderson, apparently seeing the situation in a new light, also began to look uncertain. Perhaps we should consult further with our attorneys before proceeding, she suggested carefully. Richard Wilson, however, was not backing down. His face had turned an alarming shade of red as he stepped toward me aggressively. This is obstruction. You've manipulated county officials and turned members of our own board against us. He jabbed a finger in my chest. We will not allow one stubborn rancher to block progress and development that will benefit the entire community. You mean development that will benefit your investment in Summit Resorts? Michael corrected calmly. We have documentation of your financial interest in that company and their plans to develop this land. A clear conflict of interest in your HOA actions against Mr. Reynolds. Richard lunged forward, shoving me hard enough that I stumbled backward. You think you're so clever with your legal tricks? He snarled. I'll personally see to it that you regret crossing us. There are ways to handle problems like you that don't involve paperwork. The threat was explicit, his true character finally emerging from behind the respectable businessman facade. And that, said Michael with satisfaction, gives us everything we need. He nodded toward the cameras that had captured the entire interaction. Trespassing, attempted illegal seizure, falsifying county documents, interfering with protected access, conflicts of interest, and now assault and explicit threats, all on record. Frank Martinez stepped between us before Richard could react further. I think it's time for everyone to leave this property immediately, or I'll have no choice but to call for sheriff's deputies to remove you. His official tone left no room for argument. Deborah finally seemed to grasp the seriousness of their position. This isn't over, Reynolds, she hissed as she grabbed Richard's arm and pulled him back toward their vehicle. We have resources you can't imagine. The HOA has never lost a dispute. I couldn't help but smile as they retreated. There's a first time for everything, I called after them. As they drove away, I turned to Michael. Do we have enough? He was already on his phone, dictating final additions to our legal filing. More than enough. I'm submitting the emergency injunction today and will file the full lawsuit tomorrow. They couldn't have given us a better case if they tried. He looked up with the satisfaction of a lawyer who knew he had an unwinnable case. Now we watched them crumble. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers when we arrived for the preliminary hearing. Word had spread quickly about a local rancher taking on the powerful Whispering Pines HOA, and the story had captured public attention. Local news stations had picked up on the David versus Goliath angle, particularly after I'd shared selected video clips of the confrontation at my gate. Michael looked pleased as we navigated through the crowd. "Perfect," he murmured. "Public opinion is already turning against them." Inside, Deborah and Richard Wilson sat stiffly beside their attorney, a sharp-dressed woman from a prestigious Dallas firm who looked increasingly uncomfortable as she reviewed the evidence we'd submitted. Our case was comprehensive. Multiple counts of trespassing, illegal restriction of access to my property, falsification of county documents, interference with a protected heritage easement, and obstruction of a county-designated access road. We'd also included evidence of Richard's financial connection to Summit Resorts and documented how the HOA's actions against me directly benefited his investment, a textbook conflict of interest. Judge Martha Williams, a no-nonsense veteran of the bench known for her intolerance of legal games, studied the documents carefully before addressing the court. "I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties, and I must say I'm disturbed by what I've seen." Her gaze fixed on the Wilson. "The plaintiffs have provided substantial evidence of improper actions by the HOA board, particularly concerning falsified county notifications and restriction of access to a property with clear exemption from HOA jurisdiction." The HOA's attorney attempted to argue that they had acted in good faith based on their interpretation of the bylaws, but Judge Williams cut her short. "Counselor, your clients issued a fraudulent county health violation notice. That goes well beyond a good faith interpretation of bylaws." She held up a copy of the fake notice. "This document alone could potentially result in criminal charges for impersonating county officials." During a recess, Sarah Thompson arrived with what would prove to be the final nail in the Wilsons' coffin, an email chain she'd discovered while searching through Planning Commission records. The emails between Richard Wilson, Deborah, and Summit Resorts executives detailed their strategy to apply maximum pressure on Reynolds to force sale, and included the damning line from Richard: "Once we secure the $50,000 consulting fee, we can guarantee the property will be available for development within 6 months." "This proves Richard received payment specifically to use his HOA position to force me out," I explained to Michael as we reviewed the documents. "It's not just a conflict of interest anymore, it's potentially criminal fraud." When Sarah took the stand as a witness, she explained how she'd discovered the email chain and verified its authenticity. The Wilsons' attorney objected vigorously, but Judge Williams overruled, allowing the emails into evidence. "These communications go directly to the defendant's motives and credibility," she stated firmly. The HOA's case continued to unravel as Doug Peterson, under oath and faced with potential perjury charges, admitted that Deborah had orchestrated the entire campaign against me without proper board votes or legal consultation. "She told us we had to force Reynolds out because his property was the last obstacle to a major improvement project," he testified nervously. "She said our property values would increase by 30% once his ranch was gone." Tom Miller's testimony further damaged the Wilsons' credibility, as he described how Deborah had systematically targeted other non-compliant homeowners, often focusing on elderly residents or those without resources to fight back. "There's a pattern of using HOA powers to force out unwanted residents," he explained. "I tried to object, but I was always outvoted." By the afternoon session, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Summit Resorts' attorney had appeared, not to defend the Wilsons, but to formally distance the company from their actions. While Mr. Wilson has been an investor in certain Summit properties, the company categorically denies authorizing or endorsing any improper actions against Mr. Reynolds or his property, the corporate lawyer stated. "We are conducting our own internal investigation into these allegations." Richard Wilson's face grew increasingly ashen as his support crumbled around him. Deborah maintained her composure, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. When Judge Williams called a final recess before ruling on our motion for injunctive relief, Michael leaned over with a satisfied smile. "They're done. The only question now is how badly they'll lose." The Wilsons' attorney approached us in the hallway, her professional demeanor strained. "My clients would be open to discussing a settlement," she offered quietly. "They are prepared to acknowledge the exempt status of Mr. Reynolds' property and withdraw all fines and claims." Michael laughed softly. "I'm afraid we're well past that point. Your clients trespassed, falsified documents, restricted access illegally, and Mr. Wilson physically assaulted my client while making threats, all caught on video. Not to mention the apparent $50,000 payment for what looks remarkably like influence peddling." He shook his head. "We'll be proceeding with the full case and seeking maximum damages." As we returned to the courtroom for the judge's ruling, the atmosphere had changed. The Wilsons sat in isolated defeat, abandoned by Summit Resorts, and facing not just my lawsuit, but potential criminal charges. Judge Williams' ruling was decisive and sweeping, granting our request for emergency injunctive relief and setting the stage for the final confrontation that would permanently reshape the balance of power in Whispering Pines. Judge Martha Williams did not mince words in her final ruling. The courtroom fell silent as she delivered a scathing assessment of the HOA's actions. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a blatant abuse of authority as demonstrated by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association in this case, she began, her voice steady and deliberate. "The evidence clearly establishes that the defendants engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment and illegal actions against the plaintiff, motivated by personal financial interest and a disturbing disregard for property rights and legal boundaries." I sat beside Michael, maintaining a composed expression despite the surge of vindication I felt as Judge Williams methodically dismantled the HOA's defense. Across the aisle, Deborah Wilson maintained her rigid posture. But Richard had visibly deflated, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. Their attorney had long since stopped taking notes, recognizing the case was beyond salvaging. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff on all counts," Judge Williams continued. "The defendants are hereby ordered to pay damages totaling $250,000 for trespassing, illegal restriction of access, falsification of official documents, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." She adjusted her glasses, focusing directly on the Wilson. "Additionally, Deborah and Richard Wilson are permanently prohibited from serving on any homeowners association board or similar position of authority within this county." The judge wasn't finished. "The court is also referring evidence of potential criminal conduct, including document falsification, impersonation of county officials, and what appears to be influence peddling, to the district attorney's office for review and possible prosecution." She closed her folder with finality. "Furthermore, I am ordering a full audit of the Whispering Pines HOA finances and voting records for the past 5 years, to be conducted by an independent firm appointed by this court." As the gavel fell, completing the Wilsons' public downfall, I felt a complex mix of emotions. This wasn't just about winning a property dispute. It was about standing up to bullies who had used their power to intimidate and control an entire community. The financial award was substantial, but the real victory was in breaking the HOA's stranglehold on Whispering Pines. The aftermath unfolded quickly. By that evening, emergency meetings were being called among homeowners, with many expressing outrage at how their HOA dues had been misused. Within a week, the entire board, except Tom Miller, had resigned. Summit Resorts publicly withdrew all investment in the area, their plans for a luxury development effectively dead. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation into the Wilsons' financial dealings, focusing on the $50,000 consulting fee and other potential improprieties. A special election was held to form a new HOA board, with Tom Miller elected as president on a platform of transparency and respect for homeowners' rights. His first official act was to pass a resolution acknowledging the exempt status of my ranch and several other properties that had been improperly targeted by the previous administration. "We're returning to the original purpose of this association," Tom announced at his first meeting, "to serve the community, not rule it." I decided to use a portion of the settlement money to establish a local property rights education fund, helping homeowners understand their rights and the legitimate limitations of HOA authority. Sarah Thompson agreed to serve as the fund's first director, bringing her expertise in property records and her personal commitment to fighting abuses of power. "What happened to you happens to people every day," who don't have your resources or knowledge, she told me as we set up the organization. This fund can help level the playing field. Frank Martinez, whose integrity had been crucial to our case, received formal recognition from the county commission for his professional conduct, along with a promotion to head of the inspection department. Maybe now we can restore some balance to how things work around here, he said when I congratulated him. Too many good people have been pushed around for too long. As for the Wilsons, they quietly listed their house for sale 3 months after the trial, moving to another state rather than facing their neighbor's judgment. I heard through Tom that their marriage hadn't survived the scandal, with Richard blaming Deborah for pushing too hard, and Deborah resentful of Richard's financial schemes that had exposed them to legal jeopardy. It seemed a fitting end to their alliance of convenience and ambition. The most meaningful moment for me came one evening as I stood by my gate, my rightful gate on my family's land, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant orange and purple. My father had loved this view, had fought to preserve it when developers first started eyeing the surrounding land. I'd installed a small plaque on the gatepost with his favorite saying, "Stand your ground for what's right, even if you stand alone." Thanks to the unlikely allies I'd found, I hadn't had to stand alone after all. Sometimes the best trap is simply patience and knowledge of the law. Deborah and her HOA thought they could bully anyone who didn't conform to their vision. They never imagined that by changing the lock on my ranch gate, they were stepping into a legal trap I had carefully prepared. But that's the lesson for those who abuse power. Justice may be slow, but it arrives right on time. I still get messages from people facing similar situations with their HOAs across the country. I always tell them the same thing. Document everything, know your rights, and remember that bullies count on your silence. The system may seem stacked against the individual homeowner, but with persistence and the right approach, David can still triumph over Goliath. In the end, that's what my father's legacy was truly about. Not just preserving a piece of land, but standing up for what's right, no matter the odds.
QA Stories signing off for now, but the drama, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2.